I'm Meredith Preston McGee. I'm the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Eduardo Stein, a board member to the Center and a global leader for peace building, human rights, and governance. We're so pleased, Eduardo, that you could speak to us today. I would spend some time introducing you and all of the incredible things that you've done as Vice President of Guatemala, as Foreign Minister, currently in your role as Special Representative for Venezuelan refugees and migrants. But I think that would probably take the bulk of our interview. So I think I will dive right in, if I may. We're really, for the Pluralism and the Pandemic portal, we're really interested in looking at how the pandemic has been impacting different places around the world. And so I wondered, before we speak about Latin America as a region, as a whole, and some of the larger dynamics, if you might paint us a picture of what has been happening in Guatemala since the onset of the pandemic, particularly in terms of issues of inequality and exclusion.
Well, one thing that the pandemic has done for Guatemala, which is nothing to be proud of, is to bring to the fore the many inequalities that Guatemala has as a society for centuries already. As you well know, when the Spaniards came to this continent in the 16th century, Guatemala was one of the provinces, so to speak, of the Spanish crown that didn't have gold like or silver like Mexico or Bolivia or parts of Ecuador and Peru had. So the whole of the economy rested in very cheap labor that was provided by the indigenous peoples in Guatemala. At independence, which happened in 1821, nothing changed much in this regard. So we are still having a very strong historical debt towards our indigenous peoples. 23 languages are spoken here in Guatemala, and nearly half of the population comes from indigenous peoples. So what the pandemic did was to unearth and bring to the fore many of these inequalities, and that in the medium and long term, we think is good, because it forces all of societal decision-making personalities and institutions to go back to the very basics of citizens' equality. A second thing was to show how weak our institutional scaffolding is, particularly in the health sectors. And a third thing was that in a way, all politicians as well as decision makers had to deal with the type of necessary balance that the reactivation of our economy is placing in all decision-making centers, so that we can balance out the attention for the public health needs that the pandemic has created with the options and opportunities for economic reactivation. So that, in a way, sums up the most important things that one thing, of course, is that those that are not in the capacity, economic capacity to deal with enough medical attention, and they have to rest on public health services have, of course, been mistreated in a way, but the government has made a very strong and vigorous push in creating ad hoc, like campaign-like hospitals in a rush, so that at least now Guatemala is equipped with enough hospital beds to take care of those under contagion.
I think, Eduardo, what you say about this being potentially an opportunity to force leaders to engage in a more inclusive way across society in terms of how they're budgeting, how they're thinking about the resources of the country and what they're putting it towards is something we're seeing in many different countries. I think what we're all really hoping is that these opportunities are not squandered in the recovery from the pandemic and in this desire to return to normality that actually, as I think was said by some of the activists in Chile, normal was the problem to begin with, and we need to find something new and different to go forward.
Well, normal in Guatemala was a very abnormal situation because of the permanent exclusion of many sectors of society from the services and the benefits and opportunities of development.
And I hope that people are seeing now that by excluding others, everyone is suffering in those spaces, and everyone is more at risk when we see a pandemic like this.
Yes.
I wonder, just thinking slightly more broadly now about the situation in Latin America, particularly as we've seen issues around peace and conflict. Obviously, the migration, the outward migration from Venezuela, and several other real challenges facing the region in the last several years prior to the pandemic. I was wondering if you could just reflect a bit on how you've seen these issues being exacerbated by the pandemic itself, and where you see perhaps the most critical and urgent need for attention in the region in relation to the pandemic right now.
Well, speaking globally and generally, what happened in several countries was very similar to what happened in Guatemala, that many weaknesses of the public institutional scaffolding came to the fore and brought an opportunity to straighten out in the pathway towards maturing our democratic systems. But we are facing as well a historical malady in the region, which is corruption. Unfortunately, in many countries, corruption has created an ingrained terrible habits of draining public resources into private pockets, and therefore weakening the capacity of the state to bring those basic services equally to the rest of the people. One of the central areas in which this is being felt throughout is in the justice system. And some countries like mine are experiencing this in very dramatic ways. Other countries, fortunately, have stronger judicial systems, but still, how to provide equitable and prompt juridical attention to all of the population in equitable ways has always been in shortages in several areas of the subcontinent. A second issue I would like to mention is that although the receiving countries of Venezuelan migration had experienced, of course, all kinds of pressures, but they have managed to come together and forge a sort of unwritten set of guidelines on how to deal with this, the pandemic forced all of the countries to close the borders. And that has created really difficult situations for most Venezuelan migrants because they cannot move from one country to another, which was one of the expressions of this phenomenon in the region. I should underscore the fact that this exodus from Venezuela into the neighboring countries is the largest migration and refugee crisis in all of our history. Close to 5.3 million Venezuelans have left their country into 17 neighboring countries. The most affected, of course, is Colombia, then Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Argentina, and in a way, Brazil. But in this regard, the closing of the borders gave a formidable blow to this trans-border movement. And another aspect of the pandemic is that many of those Venezuelans who had already established themselves in different territories, but that lived on a day-by-day basis, right now they are without an income. They have been facing evictions because they cannot pay the rent, and they have difficulty accessing the public health systems. So the whole push of the international cooperation efforts is concentrating in how to provide these people with enough sustainability elements so that meanwhile the whole situation in the region begins to ease up as the pandemic is being not controlled, but at least stabilized, and the number of contagions diminishes, we can go back to nurturing the self-sustainability of these people in all of the countries that they have moved towards. So in a way, we are seeing a refunctionalization, a reaccommodation, a rearrangement of resources so that these people in extreme need can still be included into the public health system and, of course, into the economic recovery dynamics.
And that's that your last point, that sort of inclusion into the recovery, and inclusion even when they are displaced persons, refugees, and migrants in other countries, being able to include them in the recovery effort really does help the entire country in which they sit. And we've seen in other places some really bold moves by leaders saying that migrants and refugees in our country are have as much of a right to healthcare and support at this time as our citizens, and Portugal is an example of that. And it leads me to really think about the power of leadership within this moment. And I wonder if you could just reflect a bit on where you see, if you see some leadership really taking root to support some of these collective efforts, and what you think could be done more by leaders, not just political leaders, but leaders throughout the region in terms of pushing for a more inclusive recovery from the pandemic.
Meredith, I'm not going to give you specific examples because I would get into trouble immediately, but but let me refer to the fact that we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and the whole of the multilateral system is under siege and under severe criticism because of what some people think that they have overstepped in their mandates, or they have not provided the type of solutions that they were hoping for, forgetting that those who decide where the agencies go, what they do, are governments themselves. And in this regard, I would like to point towards one of the issues that we are seeing in several Latin American countries occur because of the weaknesses of the political system or the insufficiencies of the political parties towards representing adequately the interests of the whole of the population. There seems to be a perilous or a dangerous divide between the lack of interest or the outright rejection from young professionals and young leaders to get involved into politics. They tend to reject this involvement because they see it as an almost automatic pathway to stain their professional careers and their reputations if they get involved in politics. So there are but a chosen few young leaders that have ventured into politics and are truly trying to produce the type of structural reforms that are needed. But because these reforms do not always reflect the type of public understanding of what kind of a country do we need and where do we want to go, because of so many very recent mechanisms of intercommunication worldwide, and of course interdependence. The whole concept of individual legal, political, constitutional frameworks and the concept of sovereignty is also being under siege. We are so interdependent today in many of the things we do that the argument in favor of total autonomy and sovereignty is really being made in Spanish pulverizado. It's really disappearing, but no one really has the power and the vision to foretell where are we moving towards and what kind of regional arrangements are really working. And going back to the Venezuelan migration and refugee crisis, many of the Andean countries, and well, for the matter, the South American countries, found themselves that their own sub-regional institutional frameworks failed to cope with this crisis. And that is why several ad hoc platforms had to be created, like the Lima Group, or what the European Union came up with the contact group, in order to provide the type of arrangements and agreements that were regionally valid, so as to promote a true search for political solutions within Venezuela that the actual Maduro regime would accept. But in this effort, in so doing or so searching, we detected in all of the countries very deep and very strong divisions amongst not only political parties or political factions or organizations, but amongst institutions. And there are crises, political crises, still ongoing in several of the countries that are in dire need of new leadership, which doesn't seem to be ready to engage.
And I think what you're describing as well is really a series of cross-cutting divisions within the region and within society. And I know we were hoping that one of the things that this common global crisis with the pandemic would remind everyone is that we have to cooperate across society, but also across countries and in regions and around the world. That I think it is, as you mentioned, the dysfunction in the multilateral system, particularly tragic at a different level right now, that in this moment of global crisis we're not able to come together in this. And when you speak about the issues around political leadership, I wonder if this also reflects really a lack of trust in a lot of the different institutions in society, a lack of trust in the multilateral system, but also a lack of trust within different countries of their own institutions, and how much that's impacting our ability or inability in a way to respond to the pandemic in a constructive way.
Well, it certainly does. That lack of trust in institutions, of course, with the very specific traits and characteristics of what's going on in every country, but it's present everywhere. Maybe with two sole exceptions: in all the subcontinent in Latin America, the rest of the countries have to deal with public security issues that were not here several decades ago. The transnational crime organizations have been the most efficient organizations in taking advantage of the new technologies, for example, not only in communications, but also in weaponry, transport, etc. And the penetration of the transnational crime organizations deep into the state structures and institutions have been in varying degrees ever present, because we are still a subcontinent that provides narcotics to all the rich countries' consumers. Secondly, aside from these security issues, and that's why I mentioned a few minutes ago the weakness of some of the justice systems, people do not trust the justice systems as they used to, if they ever did fully, because they think that these justice systems are still infected with corruption, and therefore they tend to move very quickly if the checkbooks are ready for prosecutors, judges, etc. And therefore the poor or the extremely poor do not have a ready access to the justice system. And thirdly, because this is a cultural problem that is deeply ingrained in several of our societies, mostly in those countries where the percentage of indigenous population is high, and I'm talking like Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, even Brazil, and of course my own country, Guatemala. How to deal with multiculturalism and multilingualism is still a very powerful challenge. That's why people like myself found the discussions in this organization that you represent so enriching and so thought-provoking, but so illuminating in the kinds of concrete practices, down-to-earth practices that could be instrumentalized, no, that's a bad word, that could be put into service so that the differences in languages, in cultural backgrounds, in values, could be seen as a formidable capital to build on and not as a problem that we inherited.
Absolutely. And I think we really hope that the pandemic sheds some light, as you were saying at the beginning, about all of these pre-existing challenges in society, these pre-existing inequalities, to push us to have these more frank and constructive conversations about how we embrace these extraordinary differences in society, and that those really are the basis of success, of the basis of how we actually move forward together. And I know that you know, in our Global Pluralism Award, one of the things that we like to do is inspire by example, to see some of the really extraordinary examples of pluralism in action, of people taking these huge social structural issues and finding a space to do something in different parts of society. And so I wonder, Eduardo, as we sort of wrap up this conversation and wanting to think on a positive note looking forward, if there are things right now in the region that are inspiring you, things that are giving you hope that we are moving in this direction towards a greater embracing of the diversity and a genuine addressing of the inequalities in the region.
Well, there are several, but I want to underscore one that, at least from our experience in Central America, Mexico, and several other Andean countries as well, is the fact that for the first time ever in some countries, but in a forceful way in others, women have come to the fore in a very male chauvinist oriented set of societies. This pandemic has opened up even wider doors for the participation of women, and even in the poorest of communities, it has been able to provide platforms so that their capacities, their dedication, their manifold responsibilities as even basic economic providers in their own families, many being single mothers, as well as professionally and economically providing for the families. These have been multiplying everywhere. And I think this is an extraordinary gain for the entire region. Secondly, there has been, although forced by the pandemic itself, but there has been, I think, an honest and sincere re-evaluation of the lopsided relationship between central government and local governments. Some countries have dealt with this before in successful ways. We're learning from those countries a lot, but the whole revamping of the relationship of how a central government needs to be in constant contact with local authorities and local organizations, and how losing that contact with real communities, real people, real needs, and real conquests of how they have managed to resolve their needs is extremely valuable as well in the region. The re-evaluation has given way to a reassessment and new views of how important it is to foster the participation of societal organizations at the local level and bring that representation to the central level, and forget about this centrality of capital cities, which has done so much damage throughout our history.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on, this notion of this wider participation and of recognizing that government really needs to reflect all of the people in a society, both those on the geographical periphery as well as those in an urban heartland and everywhere in between. Eduardo, I really appreciate so much you taking the time. I know you're incredibly busy with your role as the Joint Special Representative, but we appreciate so much your insights and hope that you will also come back and visit us again at the center sometime when we're all allowed to travel again.
I will certainly hope that we can meet personally again, and a big abrazo to everyone over there.
Great. Thank you so much.